other amenities that this committee has in a way sussed out, that we all believe are should be part and parcel for affordable housing. But we are committed to looking at what those opportunities are and looking at ways of developing that for affordability. I think this is probably above and beyond what the city's goals should be.
Okay, fair enough.
I had a comment on this page, and I apologize that my computer kicked me off of this briefly. But for the topic of increased housing supply to limit market pressure on rents and home prices, I wonder if there should be something in there. I mean, I know this is about housing, but revisit zoning practices concerning the ease of developing professional office space, which seems to be driving our lack of housing supply. I mean, it's a little counterintuitive, and I think I brought this up last time, that it seems like you want to have all this office supply for economic development, but we seem to be hurting ourselves with the type of development that's coming in, at least in terms of maintaining our housing supply. Does that make any sense?
Sure. And certainly what a number of cities are now doing is looking at mixed use that has office and residential in a single structure as well. So, I think that's a good reminder for us to factor in.
Carl, is that limited to, sort of the area near the university and downtown, or do you think that's a citywide phenomenon?
I mean, I seem to see it mostly around, for example, I think we've got 3 very large office buildings under construction downtown right now that are primarily office, and they're going to bring in people from outside of town to work there. And my current understanding and some of the projects I've worked on recently, it seems like zoning makes it much easier to build an exclusively office building versus building residential.
Any other comments on purpose? Okay, Lee, if we could go to the limitations. It's kind of setting the box here in some ways, which doesn't have to be a box. This is sort of a bit of a reality check. It says land use changes are difficult to implement and have a limited ability to impact housing accessibility for the lowest income residents. That it's important to acknowledge land use tools first will not necessarily decrease rent. That given the costs of development right now and the premium on rent for new construction, just building up the housing supply will not necessarily mean that those new units will be more affordable units. And so I think that's something to keep in mind, that this may create unintended development pressures. So I know that people often live in dread of their neighborhoods changing in one way or another because of new development coming in. And certainly this is a reality if you need to and want to increase housing supply, that there will be additional pressures for development as well. The risk of this is that it can also cause displacement pressure in communities, particularly those with a high percentage of renters in them. So the suggestion here is that upzoning has to be undertaken primarily in areas where these pressures would be limited. And by the way, these slides will be shared with you as well, so you'll have a chance to look at them again. The plan must also acknowledge that that just land use accommodation alone will not meet the needs of extremely low income households, that there need to be additional tools such as subsidies brought to bear to look at to make housing affordable for the lowest income residents, particularly those earning 30% of AMI or less. And finally, in limitations, that this pressure for land use change can face political and public approval barriers. I think we see that often. We see that as new development is proposed in well-established neighborhoods. So it's something that I think we need to address as this plan moves forward, not at the end of the plan moving forward, but in the process of it moving forward, to allow people to start to understand what those changes might be, what the potential for change might be, and what the scale of change could be as well. Are there any other limitations that we need to acknowledge?
I kind of feel like I just want to highlight the part where it says it may create unintended development pressures really makes it difficult to deal with your previous slide where you want to redress racial segregation through the single family zoning. And I'm glad you note this as a limitation, but I just want to highlight it because again, it's where we've got primarily minority neighborhoods. They tend to be single family zoned and they tend to be located in areas that would make sense from, if you didn't know any better, to upzone them because they're close to downtown, they're close to the main corridors through the city. Right. So it's, and yeah, the displacement, I mean, it would be, could potentially reduce our number of minorities in the city even more than we already have.
It's good to know.
May I ask a question?
Alice.
So this just follows up in a way on Jody's point before about available land in the city. When we were looking at, available land, for the potential for development, we did notice that there was a fair amount of land in prime locations that I believe was owned by Public Housing Authority, around Water Street, not far from Friendship Court and Crescent Hall. Is anyone familiar with all that? And when I said, and I asked innocently, boy, this is prime location for housing. It's walkable to the mall. It's near other housing and residential areas. The response I got was, kind of a shrug of the shoulders saying it's owned by public housing and it can't be developed, which to me seems one of those land use things that should really be looked at and looked at opportunities. Jody, Jody Alejandro, do you know what I'm talking about?
Like with First Street, and yes, I know what you're talking about, and but I'm like you. I don't understand why it can't be developed. But I remember the same answer. It's Seville Public Housing.
Yeah, exactly. So these, in a way, are those bureaucratic things that seem like it takes a groundswell of, leadership to look into because, I'm sorry if I sound a little flippant. It's just that I had been down this road a number of times. We own the foundation owns Foxhaven Farms, right? It's raw land. The development cost is crazy because there's no utilities. It's not near public transportation. It's not near. It's so many things. So everyone says, oh, well, you can develop Foxhaven, and my immediate response as an urbanist is, you've got this acreage right in the middle of the city. Why would you want to go out to Foxhaven? Unless you want to go to Foxhaven, but that just makes so more sense that you would not be required to have a car. It's near public transportation. It's adjacent to other residential areas. And because there's this bureaucratic hurdle, that I'm sorry, I'm on a soapbox, but
Alice,
Alice?
do you know where we might be able to get our fingers on that map?
uh,
City's GIS.
Yeah.
Look at the zoning
I
map.
love that.
I mean, you could also ask, Sunshine, Nathan, right? He took us on a little tour. He's aware of all this.
Now, Alice, for instance, the First Street public housing, that additional land is actually now allowing them to redevelop that area. They are first going to build new units on the extra land and then start to replace the existing units with a greater density. So in that case, it's turned out to be a benefit and will benefit in creating a greater density. And I think there will be a mixed income in that area, just like what's happening at Friendship Court.
Right. There's another area, Jody, and I'm sorry, this all goes back to pre-COVID, so my brain is pre-COVID times, not the virus. Is it 6th Street? Is that possible? Is the area around 6th Street?
I'm sorry, I don't know. It doesn't ring a bell.
When I get back to the office, I can look in my files and see if I see anything. But we definitely took tours, and I was just astonished by, the amount of land that was so close to the downtown mall.
Alice, if you could send us that information once you can look at your notes, that would be really appreciated.
Sure.
Yeah, I think 6th Street between Belmont and Ix Building.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That seems to be like empty lots there. Large, is that
Yeah.
right?
Well, it's underutilized. It's just townhouse and 2 apartment units. West Haven is the same. So when they were built, it was a smaller density. And I'm guessing the plan is for the Redevelopment Housing Authority that will in the future then be redeveloped to create more units and then be the opportunity having mixed income in those areas.
Yep. I just, so I agree. And I'll try to look for that information and
That would be great.
But, when you look at this shape the city is in, that is so prime. Shouldn't there be some way of dealing with the bureaucracy somehow and speeding up that development?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that what we have to do is look at all the different opportunity areas and then back out and figure out if somebody says these can't be developed, what the reasons are behind that, and not just take it as a given,
Right.
but really understand, is it because of tradition? Is it because of, I think a lot gets put under the heading of historic, and what does that mean? And I think that I think we have to look at all of those reasons for why things haven't been developed, why areas haven't been developed in the past, and see what can be done.
A hot area right now under discussion is within the Star Hill neighborhood new plan, the city yard, the utilities yard and city utilities down near what was Vinegar Hill right next to Vinegar Hill. So that has become a key point of the new Star Hill small area plan that's been put forward.
Okay. All right. So if we move on then to let's talk about recommendations. then, there are 4 categories of recommendations here that we will explore. One is multifamily by right. So these are all under the heading of revised regulations and development approval processes to increase supply of housing and slow increase in costs while protecting low-income communities. So the first is multifamily by right, which includes zoning changes and different thinking of the development processes needed to increase production of multifamily housing and expand by right development. The next one is soft density by right, changing the zoning in certain areas to allow soft density, and we'll talk about that in a minute, in single family neighborhoods while limiting displacement in low-income communities. The next is ADUs, accessory dwelling units, which looks at increasing flexibility for single family homes and other homes like duplexes, et cetera, to provide public funding to support affordability, and then inclusionary zoning, creating mandatory zoning policies to increase affordable housing units as part of new development. So have we, I guess my first question, we have, by the way, a great deal of information that we can look at under each of these 4 categories. And we're happy to go to that level of detail. But I thought we could first explore these in general and then go to the detail as we need to. Since we have another 40 minutes, we have time to do that. So let's go. Are there any other recommendation categories that you think we've omitted from this in terms of land use?
What about changing zoning to reduce the minimum lot size? And also to reduce the road frontage requirements for residential lots, or even eliminating it?
Jody, I'm going to suggest we can collect those into soft density.
Okay.
Part of that is about infill, and not just about the production of new subdivisions, really, but more about, yeah, what if I did get hold of a former church property and I'm going to redevelop it as housing? You know, does it just end up being large single-family houses, or can we actually produce something which begins to help with these housing pressures? I've written those 2 down, and I'll make sure that we talk to the team about whether they had originally thought that those were in play here, but certainly they should be in discussing the zoning.
We have a zoning category of RU, I think it is, for small area or small lots. And those are places that occurred naturally in the city that were just very, very small lots. And thus we have a lot of small houses as a result of it in those places. And that has done a lot to limit the expense of those houses because the lots are so small. Now, there are places in Belmont where people are buying the lots and building 3-story houses on those lots, but it's still it's a hindrance or a barrier to someone coming in and building getting a half-acre lot and or the size of lots in Meadowbrook or Greenbrier, which are much larger.
I don't know if now is the time to raise this, but I have sort of an editorial suggestion for the multifamily by right title to add the tagline to that title: in traditionally exclusionary neighborhoods, because multifamily by right could accelerate gentrification and displacement of people who live in some of the historically Black neighborhoods that have not flipped yet. And so I'd love to look at multifamily by right as a way to integrate the neighborhood as opposed to potentially further pushing people out.
So Dina, are you comfortable with my sharing that slide that has the map?
No, why don't you do that?
So this is a map that HRNA prepared on this issue. And in this case, they were looking at something that they called opportunity parcels. So they were zoned single family. They're within a quarter mile of a transit corridor. They're within a mile of an employment center. And they attempt to take out the sort of at-risk parcels that were low income. So, Emily, what are your thoughts when you see this pattern? If we were to consider, this kind of upzoning, are these some of the kinds of places that might be appropriate or not? You're muted. I apologize.
This is helpful. I have not had a chance to study the material
Sure.
that was sent, so I don't really even have the capacity on my somewhat limited monitor size to tell what I'm looking at very well. But I think that's a really great set of sort of characteristics that you're looking at. It would be good to overlay that with race, because I think it's not just primarily low income, but it's also primarily Black, because it's neighborhood integrity in neighborhoods that are very much now desired by white folks to move in. So
Sure.
I think that's something to add.
My admittedly limited understanding of the community suggests that more of those are to the south and east here, especially the ones that are kind of the hottest right this minute, and have been for a few years. And those have been pulled out. There would be discussion of the appropriateness of accessory dwelling units. Might be very valuable in a setting like that. Helps with the elderly, helps with the kids coming back, helps with all kinds of things. Whether there's a discussion of other kinds of more density, if you were, for example, to take those areas and allow the tools that Jody was talking about, narrower lots with less lot area, would you lose the original population in trade for, a new population? Likely. So I think there needs to be a discussion about areas where these tools might be appropriate. We intend to kind of deploy the whole tool set, but not equally across the city. If you've been following this issue in Portland or Minneapolis, you know that they have sort of deployed the tool set uniformly just about across the city. And it will be fascinating, to see what the change in the patterns becomes over time. I think Charlottesville has such strong patterns that, and frankly, such a history that you need to really stop and think about where those tools apply. So this map might be a start. It might be a whole nother map. It might be another set of factors, but there is the beginning, at least, of some thinking about this. So it's worth looking at this. We could perhaps, well, this show will get published on the website, and some conversation will probably start surrounding this issue.
The other thing that might be really interesting to look at is, even if an area isn't a quarter mile, within a quarter mile of a transit corridor, where could a transit corridor easily adjust? And I know that involves a whole different part of urban planning and a whole different neighborhood, a whole different office in the city outside of NDS, most likely, to get that kind of information. But I do think transportation has to expand if we're going to be increasing affordable housing significantly.
I agree. And I think that the assumption that we're going into this with is not that we're going to just accept the transit routes that are currently there, but I think we are going to look at where the opportunity areas are and then work with transit, transportation people to talk about the opportunities for transit in new areas rather than maybe and how they can connect with existing networks, et cetera. So that, you know, I think it would be a huge mistake to just take things as they are. I think we need to look at that transportation change as in part, a major part of where housing should go, but not be the lead. Transportation should not be the lead in that.
I think also that the urban ring comes into play in this particular discussion. And we are really talking, especially in land use, about changing the zoning within the city, although perhaps surrounding areas might also pick up on some of those same kinds of zoning tools. There's no guarantee that they will. So there's a little bit of a stymie there because we're not looking at the full extent of the problem. It really is the city's boundary that is giving us this parcel set, when we know if we went just a little bit farther, you know, we might find some even more opportune parcels that lie out there in the urban ring.
Yeah, Jody.
Uh,
We have 2 Jodys in our group.
I know. um,
She's prettier.
aw. Question for everyone as we're looking at all of these. I know, being a county person, a county planner, we are struggling with commuter traffic coming inbound through the county into Charlottesville. And so one of the things that concerns me, and I'm just curious about, is how would you all envision addressing parking, for example, on the Preston Avenue, 5th Street intersection area where that little north downtown area is? I know the streets are crazy congested there already and there's no parking availability. So if we suddenly went to multifamily, we'd have even less parking availability there. And so I'm just kind of wondering, are we seeing parking discussions going hand in glove with some of these things to address some of those issues? Because I think it's just worth a conversation.
And because it'll be brought up as a major issue. Lee, do you want to take that one?
Well, so our firm, I don't know if you guys caught on to that, but our firm is doing the zoning piece as Roadside's team continues on. And our largest project has been the past 7 years. We've been working in Los Angeles, and we've just gotten the first draft of the code out after 7 years, which we're hoping it doesn't take in Charlottesville. On our steering committee equivalent, we have the sort of 2 preeminent parking wonks around the country, Don Shoup and a guy named Rick Wilson. And they have both expressed that at this particular point in time, perhaps not in the particular place that you were talking about, Jody, but in general, at this point in time, retaining minimum parking requirements is actually racially inequitable because of the difference in ownership of vehicles and the difference in travel patterns because of many, many reasons. We've been holding activity down by using the land area required for cars, the cost of the production of parking for, car parking spaces as part of what raises and increases prices. So there will have to be some kind of balance. It could be that closer to the downtown, that there is an obligation for the city to be involved in the production of parking, as it will have to be involved in the production of transit, improved transit, as perhaps it will be involved in the production of safer and better bike lanes, which give people those opportunities. All of the modes need to get better in order to tackle the problem that you're describing. So I do think that there will be a substantial discussion surrounding whether minimum parking requirements are retained. Now, it could well be that the city would use its contractual authority if it's involved in, subsidizing housing or whatever else. It could use those other authorities other than zoning to require the production of parking if in a certain location it's necessary, in others it's not. So there are other tools that we could use to get at parking, especially when there's subsidy involved, that we should, consider rolling out rather than necessarily our big stick of the zoning ordinance, and especially a one-size-fits-all kind of approach to the zoning ordinance.
Let me just be really clear. I'm not advocating for parking minimums. I think we need to talk about this because I think that will be one of those topics that
it will inevitably come up. So yes, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
You're absolutely right.
And it's one of the first issues that people bring up when you talk about change. So it has to.
Especially density increases. We've seen both traffic and parking as we've tried to employ additional density in the county. It's traffic and parking all day long at the planning commission and at the board too. So just didn't want to leave those undiscussed.
Well, so part of that, so let's make sure everybody understands the implication of what HRNA has said here. Part of the reason that they're saying by right approval is to frankly get around some of those conversations that are barriers to improving equity and access. So this is a proposal. This is a recommendation that says the community gets to speak at the planning level, but the community is then implementing the plan through the technical planning process of staff and other ministerial mechanisms. And only if you want to vary from that would you be out in a public conversation of any kind. So that's a huge dodge for some of the challenge that you're talking about, Jody, is if that people really agree, and I see Carl nodding his head, so I'm going to say Carl's on the same page. If people really agree that the process, not just the standards that Jody was talking about, but the process of getting through an approval, of talking about traffic, of talking about density, of dumbing down your project until it's palatable to everyone in the immediately surrounding neighborhood, change is unlikely to occur in any meaningful way.
Well, so your recommendation is it sounds like you're recommending to get rid of the discretionary review. I think we already have by right review in the city. It's just if you want a special use permit or if you're in a design control district. I mean, people will rant and they'll go to council and they'll yell and they'll scream, but there's nothing they can do about a project that has by right approval. And we've got plenty of that happening already.
Yeah, and I'm going to say yes, but. Dina will recall we were involved in West Main, and the Board of Architectural Review basically rethought our proposal for us, and what got adopted does not look like what was originally recommended, principally surrounding the issue of density and some other issues.
I think that was a planning commission.
What's that?
I don't know. You guys did that in the last, how long ago was that?
So the first run at it, the staff did get it adopted. It really was the first round of that, which is probably 5 years ago, Dina?
Yeah, I was going to say 5 or 6 years ago.
I guess I'm sorry. I'm on the BAR. I've been on it for 7 years.
Okay.
I don't remember us.
Did you see my face?
Maybe
it's
No, I'm sorry. My computer keeps kicking me out of here. So if I missed a slide or something, but
no.
Yeah. So, but that is, again, that's kind of, I guess this is a stupid point. That's that was planning process, and now the code is in place. And if someone wants to develop something, there's a by right process, and I think the SUP is only for density now on
Yes,
West Main.
yes.
I have a question about just back to the parking has it ever been successful just to let parking be market driven?
Yes,
And is that something that might work in Charlottesville, or are there reasons that we want to be
absolutely.
scared of that?
Absolutely would work in Charlottesville.
Okay.
It absolutely does work. When parking, you know, you know, nobody goes there anymore. It's too popular, right? You've heard that phrase. You know, it is. People figure it out. We all, you know, bitch and complain at the time of change, but fundamentally people do figure those things out. You have very awkward parking situations in your downtown. People don't understand the location of where a lot of your parking is, and the, you know, the enormous amount of availability you actually have. So you know, the community will figure these things out as parking gets tighter. And yes, it is a model where luxury housing might still provide, you know, 2 underground spaces below your 5-story building. But where if we're trying to generate affordability, we won't produce anything but a few surface parking spaces with, you know, maybe a little cover over them, just to bring the cost down.
Lee, if you want to go back,
Yes.
since we skipped ahead, I think so the next slide, not back, but forward. And yeah, I think that it would be useful to start with this because it states that Charlottesville's current zoning and development policies limit the production of multifamily housing. And the tool here is to change zoning and development processes to increase the production of multifamily housing and expand feasible by right development to begin to reverse entrenched patterns of racial segregation. The interesting thing I saw is a sentence right after the black bolded sentence that says the city needs more housing for renters of all incomes, but only 3% of the city's acreage is zoned for multifamily, and development feasibility in these areas is limited. So, and that this directly impacts or indirectly increases the multifamily by right development, increases affordability indirectly. So the tools or recommendations here are that the city should revise its zoning and approval processes to increase by right multifamily development. And the city needs to set growth goals and support the development of enough housing to accommodate planned growth through revisions that need to include where multifamily development is allowed to ensure that that development is feasible without a special use permit by right, which gets to a little bit of our previous conversation about that. Identify areas suitable for upzoning in more neighborhoods while mitigating displacement pressure in low-income neighborhoods. To revise development to limit discretionary control and build toward a culture among city staff that encourages collaboration. And I think that that would be rare for many cities, but it's certainly a really important
It's
goal.
possible. Yeah, it is possible.
Definitely possible to do. And to identify opportunities to align multifamily zoning policy with regional partners to enhance multifamily housing within the urban ring. What is your, did we leave anything out? Do you disagree with any of these? What are your thoughts about these?
I like these. I do have that same concern that there needs to be a racial caveat. So like where it talks about identifying areas suitable for upzoning. I love all of that while mitigating displacement pressure in low income neighborhoods and historically Black neighborhoods, which I don't know how to word it, but which would continue to be majority Black. I don't think we have to worry about some parts of some of the historically Black neighborhoods that have already gone by the by. Although I'm not sure there's any that really, maybe one of the city planners who's in our group could talk about that a little. A place like Fifeville, where when I door knocked 10 years ago, every household was Black. When I door knocked 2 years ago, none of the people who answered the door were Black. And it wasn't a small number of people, so dozens. And I don't know if that neighborhood is now majority white or not, but I think that's sort of the nuance we have to get at, is protecting the areas that are currently housing significant numbers of Black people. But otherwise, I think this is exactly what we need to be seeing.
Well, I think that qualification is very useful, Emily, to put an emphasis on retaining Black neighborhoods as Black neighborhoods, even with change. So
the other thing there's been some conversation about is an equity review. So when a developer puts in an application to the city for a project, that they would need to provide a race equity analysis. And we tried to figure out how the city could do that, like the NDS staff could help with that, but I think it's against the Dillon rule, if I remember right. So the idea would then be, oh, actually, I think I'm remembering this the opposite. So the suggestion was to have the city conduct the review, and that is against the Dillon rule, but I don't know. But anyway, you get my point. That somehow requiring a step that would look at race equity to say, how will this impact the neighborhood along racial lines and along affordability lines too, would be really helpful.
So, Emily, I think again, the challenge is in order to not burden the process of developing housing, you'd want that to be as simple as possible. So can we pre-check some places and give them, a thumbs up? And then we can have other places that we say, hey, maybe we have to look twice when we're looking at this area. Some parcels might be appropriate. We're not going to be able to look at every parcel in the city. And so, how could we mix in something like that? I think it's a very interesting idea. And it certainly follows that, again, if there's any subsidy, if there's anything beyond zoning, if there's a single dollar in from the city for some reason, provision of utilities, whatever else they might help with, then those linkages could definitely be made in those instances.
Great point. I had a developer once tell me a few years back that the reason he develops in the lower income neighborhoods in Charlottesville is because they don't fight him. And he knew if he went to some of the other neighborhoods that he'd be tied up in lawsuits for years and it would cost him money. So that to me says,
so again,
a basic race equity issue there that we need to figure out how to combat.
If land were appropriately zoned, and if using that land for what it's zoned for was simply allowed, then maybe we'd be able to get there.
Yeah.
I would like to touch on your third bullet point, and where you say limit discretionary control. I think it should be more of focused discretionary control where it matters. I don't know how you want to rewrite that. But again, like you said, keep the BAR out of zoning. I do think the BAR has a role when it comes to massing to some extent, but discretionary control, I think, is important when someone wants something special, but it should be focused and it should be yeah, I mean, like you guys have been saying this. I mean, if the city thinks it's right to build a, 6-story buildings around a certain area, people should be able to build those. They shouldn't have to ask permission to do so.
But if they need to articulate them, or they need to, mass them appropriately, transition them to the neighborhood behind them, all those kinds of things, yes. To the extent that the zoning doesn't control those elements, then you need a body like the Board of Architectural Review to do that job.
I'd also love it if you highlighted or bolded encourages collaboration, but that could just be a pet peeve of mine. The site plan review process feels discretionary, even if it's not meant to be.
Okay.
Okay. This is a good segue, I think, Lee, into soft density.
Can I just add one other tiny thing, which is on the last slide, we might want to add something about expedited review for nonprofits working more smoothly than I have heard it currently does. I think someone would need to really dig into that, but I've heard it's not actually doing what it could do to help nonprofits develop affordable housing. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that was good. I don't think we have that anywhere, so that's really good. So soft density, we have a definition of soft density, and then we have 1, 2, 3 different tools for this, or recommendations for this. So soft density is looking at changing zoning to allow for soft density in single-family neighborhoods while limiting displacement of low-income communities. And very similar to multifamily by right, soft density by right has a goal of expanding the supply of housing, access to housing, lowering, therefore, the cost for entry of residents into mixed income neighborhoods, et cetera, while still leaving the neighborhoods in a relatively lower density than they would if you put multi-story units within a single family neighborhood. So as the slide that Lee is currently showing, the patterns of racial segregation persist in Charlottesville, as we all are familiar with, following historically redlined neighborhood boundaries. And so the next slide talks about defining parcels that are currently zoned for single family development within block groups that have a higher than average white population, and looking at opportunities for how these could be, units can be added to these areas that would then exclude any parcels that are within block groups that are primarily low income or within a historic district. So what is your feeling about soft density, particularly by right soft density, and the expansion to allow for this kind of an increase in density in single family neighborhoods? It's definitely something that, as Lee was mentioning, is a pattern that's happening across the country right now as single family zoning is being dropped. The alternatives often go to what is being called soft density right now.
Can you go back to the definition of soft density? I'm sorry, it's not ADUs, it's
It can include ADUs, Carl, in my mind.
so it's
It starts there, it's duplex and up. Anything below a true full-on apartment building, maybe including a small apartment building, but maybe stopping at the multiplex. So certainly townhouse, multiplex, duplex, triplex, quadplex. It's those options, and they would not need to be necessarily spread everywhere. Certainly one question, and if we don't mix it in here, we might not get to it, so I'm going to mix it in here. One question has to be, can we put ADUs everywhere? And we simply make that easier everywhere, including in historically Black neighborhoods, because they don't really force you to tear down the main house. There's no benefit to tearing down the main house, in fact. So they're not as threatening a tool as the smaller lot sizes and other kinds of things that might actually, be more of an upzoning, which would actually threaten the existing product. Could that kind of thing be everywhere as a starter? I know that it's not really on this slide, but.
I personally think it should be. I mean, one of the other benefits is that one of the units has to be owner occupied, which I think prevents, a developer or an apartment owner from buying up a bunch of properties and leasing them out absentee.
Or
I agree.
tied to income. So allowed everywhere, but it must have an affordable income requirement that would be very deeply affordable, because I think the danger is you get more Airbnbs.
I mean,
Why doesn't that get controlled by your Airbnb regulations? Sounds like you need better
Right.
Airbnb rules.
That's going to be tough, though. They have a lobby. That's my sense of things.
Well, ignoring their lobby, there is demand for that product. That's for sure. So it is a tough question.
I have a question on the soft density opportunity parcels and the exclusion of block groups that are primarily low income. Or in the historic district, would it be, because I'm thinking if I were renting to a low income person and wanted to increase the density on that parcel, could we partner a redevelopment of that parcel with a non-displacement policy so that we aren't allowing displacement of the low-income person, but the owner gets more density, possibly being able to offer additional units, but with a promise that there's no displacement for the person that lives there now.
That's an intriguing idea, Jody. I think that's worth raising with HRNA.
This is kind of funny because the soft density, you see it historically throughout the city. It was here before, I mean, every neighborhood has little bits and pieces of it. And it works really well and it fits in really well. But yeah, I do see the concern that if you plopped it into 10th and Page, for instance, would you get some houses being torn down for little apartments?
Yeah, until the 1950s, even the federal government considered a single unit and a duplex to be fundamentally the same thing. And it was 3 or more that, began to include the discussion of multifamily or other things. So yes, most districts included a lot of those. And even if it took a special process, many old houses have been split up and some even unsplit again as the neighborhoods become more valuable. So yeah, it's a common process.
Well, and I know we don't like discretionary review processes, but there is a small parcel SUP process in the city, but it's only for a very limited area. And I'm wondering if that could be expanded to allow soft density, but also allow the city to put conditions on development that it doesn't displace people.
A good question. How do you think people, Minneapolis stopped at 3 units. They started their conversation at 4, but they stopped at 3 in what they adopted in their plan and in their zoning. And 3 units fit on many urban parcels. how do you feel about 5, 6, 7, 8 units? Not necessarily on the same parcel size, but within the same neighborhood.
Well, we have that in the city now on First Street North, for example. We've got quite an array of high-end houses and apartment buildings, and I think where my condo is, it's Charlottesville Towers, and we've got 6 floors and 72 units on down a little street. So we've got that already.
Great, we'll look at that.
I agree. I also think you have to ask for more than you're likely to get, because this will be controversial. So if we start
Yeah.
at the point of what we're
Good
okay
point.
with in the long run, then we'll end up with duplexes, which is not enough. So if we start at 24 unit apartment buildings, then we may end up with 12 unit apartment buildings. And you can hide, you know, with creative design. I've seen some really great examples of curb appeal multifamily housing
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
doesn't look like an apartment building, but it really does
Yes.
have a lot of, you know, dozens of people.
Yes.
I think that's a good suggestion.
So we have 2 minutes, I think, before she's going to dissolve our group. So could we touch on inclusionary for just a moment?
Yeah, because I think ADUs are very, you know, are so similar
Yep.
to the whole soft.
Yep.
So
Apparently we have 50
We're getting the
seconds.
high sign.
The question is, should we
go
ever
ahead.
be demanding, should we ever be requiring the provision of affordable housing as
Yeah.
part of a bonus program, as part of getting a financial incentive?
There's enough demand in the city that, yeah, we should definitely.
We
Okay.
do in the county, and we have a 15% minimum, and we get it without anybody batting an eyelash.
Okay. Got it.